Here's recording. And with that, I'm going to introduce, so for the past several years, at Acadia, we've been working with stakeholders on intertidal management for the past several years. And of course, the pandemic threw a wrench in a lot of the in-person and relationship building parts of that. But through this, we haven't really stepped back and said, how is this doing? Are we achieving our goals with this? And we were really lucky this past winter to have Ellie Oldach, who's a grad student at University of California, Davis, be able to come up for a residency to ask exactly that. How are we doing in terms of achieving our outcomes, and to interview folks? And we're really lucky that it was Ellie that was able to do this, because she's an expert in this area. This is exactly what her grad program is in, sustainable oceans research. She has an NSF fellowship that funded this work, but she's also a graduate of College of the Atlantic right here at our front door. So look forward to hearing about your work, Ellie, and what you found, and I will hand it over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much for that introduction, Abe. That's really nice. I'm going to start sharing my screen here. Okay, and let's see, presenter view. Okay, I do have to change this around a little bit. Hang on. Okay, actually, so before I get into the slideshow, I actually wanted to try doing something that I haven't done in a presentation before. It might be somewhat new to all of you as well, but it would be really nice to kind of get a sense of who's in the room. So I set up this Slido presentation, and it'll take me 1 second to get there. Okay. So hopefully you all can see this page. We've got there's a QR code in the corner. Hopefully you can see that. If you take your smartphone and scan that QR code, it'll let you respond to this question. What activities do you do in Acadia's Intertidal? And we'll start to see some of these responses pop up. So just to get a sense of who all's here and what all of us do in the Intertidal, whether that's research or management or art or daydreaming or harvesting. So go ahead and take your phone, scan that QR code, see if you can get to the page where you can start kind of entering in different things that you do in the Intertidal. And hopefully, if this works, fingers crossed, we'll start to see some of these things pop up, and there they are. That's great. So definitely we've got some researchers in the room. That's cool. People that play. Managers, recreation, coordination. I like that. It's definitely speaks to these workshops for sure. So folks, if you're just joining, go ahead and use your phone to scan this QR code and respond to the question about what you do in the Intertidal. There is also the option to go to slido.com and put in this code 883704. So it seems like more researchers and managers. I think as these words get bigger, we've got more responses coming in on each of them. And we'll give it another minute or so. So feel free to keep putting in things that you do. Passing through. Nice. Oh, be wowed. I love that. Certainly many parts of the Intertidal are kind of jaw-dropping. Play and public education. Nice. Chill out is really good. Yeah. Sometimes I go read in the Intertidal, like the bar in Bar Harbor is really, can be a good spot to duck away and lie in the sun and read. Sunbathe and nap, yeah. Explore with kids, be at peace. And then research we're really seeing is pretty central. Wow, thank you all. I'm gonna stop or switch my presentation, but feel free to keep putting things in. I will go back and look at it again at the end. Work with harvesters. Sorry, I'm obviously still pretty intrigued by this. Harvest clams. Yeah, so thank you all for giving us a sense of what we're all doing out there. Okay, and now I'll go ahead and switch to the presentation itself. I think if I share a portion of my screen, then I can get this in the right spot. I'm going to turn off closed captioning. That's okay. All right. Okay, so thank you all so much for being here. It's really great to get a chance to talk to you a little bit about the work that I've done on the Intertidal workshops in Acadia. And as Abe has already introduced, this was really a chance to kind of look back at these workshops that have taken place over the past multiple years and get a sense of what happened, what have some of the outcomes been. And a really important part of that is this question of what can we learn going forward around intertidal management, around working with communities from this kind of years-long sort of experiment that's already been underway. So this is our kind of Slido introduction. Thank you all you chill outers and public educators and researchers in the Intertidal. You're already familiar, everyone on this call, with Acadia's Intertidal. It's a coastal park, so there's this swath of ecosystem that is exposed to humans at low tide, hidden by the sea at high tide, and looks, you know, in the spring, summer, and fall, kind of beautiful and idyllic like this. And of course, if you're me and you set up a January through March residency, the Intertidal often looks like this. A little bit brutal, still beautiful. But in fact, the Intertidal has a ton of different faces. It is the mud flats, these sort of vast tidal expanses. It's also things like sand beach that are broad swaths of beach at low tide for people to enjoy and slightly skinnier at high tide. This is a place where people harvest clams and worms, as well as might harvest seaweed or periwinkles, depending. It's a place where researchers are certainly very active. It sounds like lots of folks on this call are well aware of that. It's rocky habitats that support algal canopies, that support a number of different invertebrate communities. It's sandy habitats, it's mud. It's sort of, the Intertidal has a ton of different faces. By its very nature, it's constantly changing with the tides. And it represents this very dynamic and kind of multifaceted set of ecosystems for Acadia National Park managers to kind of figure out how they're going to manage and for what and for who. And it also, as these photos represent, it is a very peopled landscape, whether that's for recreation, research, or harvest. There's people are not by any means sort of separated from the Intertidal. It's also a landscape that is facing some broader level changes. There's the day-to-day dynamic nature of the Intertidal, but there's also broader changes. The most obvious one might be sea level rise, where those tide lines are going to change and the shape of the Intertidal will change as well. There are also changes on the human side, sort of demographics along the coast or visitors coming to the park that'll create situations that have to be responded to and managed as well. And so how are a set of managers supposed to respond to this really dynamic, complex peopled system? In Acadia, the choice that was made by the Resource Management Division was to undertake a series of participatory intertidal workshops that brought together people from around these different intertidal user groups to sort of talk about this dynamic ecosystem and learn about it together and try to make some decisions around management together. And so this timeline kind of just overviews exactly what Abe has already described. The workshops began in 2016, and they extended, with some pauses here and there for various reasons, all the way till this spring, the most recent one in March. And at the same time as these workshops, which are on the top line, were taking place, there are also some broader kind of contextual changes happening around Acadia's intertidal that I call out on the bottom line. Planning began as a result of the park sort of seeing a need for intertidal focus in the midst of its broader conservation planning. So planning for intertidal workshops that could bring people together to share knowledge and expertise about this ecosystem in particular. But planning really shifted shortly thereafter when there was an event that you all might remember where Acadia National Park rangers sanctioned intertidal harvesting of worms for the first time in anyone's memory, at least. And that really created a community sort of response that we'll talk about more later. That really happened right before sort of these workshops took off and became part of the story. We'll go through more of this as the presentation goes on, but just to give you sort of a broad overview. And I think some of the people that are on this call attended some or many of these workshops. But for folks who might not have, or for folks who are kind of new to it like me, I just wanted to give you a picture of what these workshops looked like. So like I said, the first one was in October 2016. This was kind of a big 2-day meeting up at Schoodic with a variety of different activities. So there were roundtables, as you can see here. There's kind of small group breakouts. There were a couple of external facilitators brought on to sort of guide this meeting, including Natalie Springle from Sea Grant. There was team building through this rather infamous sort of pasta and marshmallow challenge.
Ellie, you just muted yourself somehow.
Thanks, Chris. I think that was Chris. Yeah, researchers, harvesters, folks from federal agencies kind of all came together for this two-day event. The next meetings were in 2017. So in February, up here in the corner, again, it was at Schoodic Schoodic Commons, sort of in the conference room, more of kind of putting Post-it notes on the wall and really brainstorming and thinking together about the intertidal. And then things kind of shifted in May 2017 when the group gathered, but instead of working inside in the conference room, really went out into the intertidal. And the harvesters became the teachers, the experts, the leaders of the day. There was a bit of a hiatus, and then in June 2019, people came back together. At this point, the composition of the group was changing a little bit. So there was folks from the tourism industry brought into these meetings, as well as from aquaculture. So voices that hadn't been present in earlier meetings came to these. And then again, a hiatus for rather obvious reasons. And we met again this March 2022 over Zoom. And I didn't take a screenshot, which I'm not sure why, but you all know what a Zoom room looks like. This was a researcher-focused meeting. So different researchers that conduct research projects in Acadia's intertidal came together to sort of share what they were up to. So that's kind of an overview of what these workshops were. And as they're sort of going on and continually being planned and carried out, there is this kind of comprehensive question that hadn't really yet been totally asked, which is what these actually meant for intertidal management. And so that's really what I came in to take a stab at. What can folks at Acadia learn about community engagement and about intertidal management through looking back at these participatory workshops? And to understand that, I really wanted to get a sense of the process of these workshops, the context that they were carried out in, any outcomes that I could find, any expectations that were either met or not met over the course of the workshops, and what the park can learn moving forward. And that's kind of what I'd like to share with you today. And so my process for this, like Abe said, I was in residence at in Bar Harbor at headquarters from January to March this year. And during that time, I had these ongoing meetings with my core research advisory team, Abe, Hannah, and Rebecca, to sort of check in to hear their understanding of how these workshops came about and their role in really leading them, as well as questions that would be useful for them to have answers to as they think about conducting further meetings. I dug into any archives I could find. These were mostly digital, but sort of notes about each of the meetings, funding requests, participant lists. And then most importantly, I conducted semi-structured interviews with people who were participants at these meetings, who could sort of tell their firsthand experience of taking part in them, as well as people who didn't take part in the meetings, but are important active members of the intertidal community. And so what that looked like in the end is that I interviewed 24 people. And so you can see here, it's broken up by role in these kind of multicolored boxes, and then whether they were a participant or a non-participant. And the intensity of green just indicates sort of how many people that fit in these different roles I was able to speak to. So spoke to a lot of planners. Obviously, all the planners were also participants in these meetings, as well as people from Acadia National Park who both took part and didn't take part in these meetings. It was really important to speak to a breadth of commercial users. I was only able to reach people who participated. Notably, there were no kind of Wabanaki community members that were involved in these meetings, and I didn't speak to any who did not take part in the meetings. Spoke to a lot of research folks. That was certainly a kind of a natural sort of bias to this work, and I was able to speak to both people who had taken part and who hadn't. Resource management at a municipal level, a state level, and a federal level were all kind of important pieces of this story to understand. And then there is this other category, and regrettably, there were some artists and sort of community at large participants in these meetings, and I didn't get a chance to speak to them. But from talking to all of these people, I was able to kind of develop this sort of multi-perspective take on what these workshops were and what they led to. And so the first thing I'd really like to go through with you today is looking back at these meetings. What are some of the major themes that emerged over the course or throughout these interviews, throughout these experiences? And the first one that comes up time and time again is the really important role of managing conflict in these meetings. So as I sort of alluded to earlier, right before this first meeting, there was this incident where an Acadia National Park ranger asked a wormer to dump out their catch and sort of sanctioned commercial harvest in the intertidal. Commercial harvest was never formally allowed in Acadia's intertidal. Typically, national parks prohibit commercial harvest, but this was a situation where it had never really been enforced for decades, and there was more than 100 years of use of this area for commercial harvest that sort of continued even after the park was instated, up until 2016, that is, when it became sanctioned. And perhaps no surprise, this was not received very well by worming and clamming communities, as well as broader communities around Acadia. So these are some of the headlines that emerged at that time. There was a lot of kind of organizing in commercial harvest communities to sort of ask why this regulation would be enforced now when it hadn't been for decades, and sort of emphasize the value of these areas to these communities for harvesting. And so in responding to that, we see this sort of split between a legislative track of response and the workshop track. And so just focusing on the legislative track for a moment, this involved a series of meetings between some of the higher level policymakers or people that are able to influence policy. So this involved the superintendent of Acadia National Park, the commissioner for the Maine Department of Marine Resources, the representatives of the congressional delegation, meeting with harvesters and other people in the community who were impacted by enforcement to sort of talk about this conflict that had come up and try to understand what a resolution might look like. Over time, that did lead to a change in Congress that was formalized through the passage of the Dingle Act in 2019 that formally legalizes commercial harvest of clams and worms in Acadia's intertidal. So that's sort of how that side got resolved. But at the same time as this legislative track was sort of going on its way, there was also this series of workshops. And the workshops pretty explicitly or specifically don't involve the same level of policymakers. So this is the division leads. These are from the national park. These are state and federal researchers or leads at a regional level rather than maybe a statewide level or an agency level. This also involved a lot more researchers and sort of a broader set of harvesters and other community members. And so in the workshops, there was a lot of attention to sort of acknowledging what came to be called the elephant in the room in a number of these interviews, acknowledging that there was this sort of other legislative conversation happening. But in the workshop, the emphasis was really different. It was more about figuring out on the ground, how are we going to move forward? And so what does that look like? What does moving forward look like? What were the outcomes of these workshops? And so one of the main ones that comes up again and again is the importance of building relationships and how these workshops provided an avenue for people to really get to know each other. So a couple of quotes here that I think kind of indicate how this went. One participant said, you know, the resource director of Acadia National Park, resource management director, I probably maybe talked to her once or twice up to that point. Now we have a great relationship. I feel like I can call her anytime and talk to her and it would be easy. And I think that the meeting probably contributed to that. So there's this important link that's being forged between participants and between people at the park that they feel like they can now phone up when there's a problem. And it's also broader than that. Another participant said, I feel like I'm more in the loop now than I was before. And that's become normal rather than a new situation. It just seems like it's normal now to get looped into any projects that are happening in the Intertidal and the Frenchman Bay area for me. So that's really, really valuable. So here we're seeing not just sort of a connection made to people at the park, but sort of helping knit together a broader community of researchers in Frenchman Bay, not even just in Acadia. It's important to note that not every group of intertidal users benefits from the relationships that were built in the room, right? Like you can only build relationships with people who are there, and not all groups were represented or present at this meeting. So it does prompt a question about if building relationships is an important outcome of these meetings. Well, who did that happen for, and what groups might not have this sort of benefit from the meetings yet, and how could that be built in the future? Along with building relationships, people really talked about the ways that different types of knowledge were incorporated into the park's sense of intertidal management, and how that started, that effort to bring in knowledge from different people into something actionable for management, really at first rested on this tool, the Open Standards for Conservation Planning. So this is kind of a tool that's used in a bunch of different sort of Nature Conservancy and other federal agency conservation planning purposes. And it's a very structured process where you sort of walk through each of the steps to map out what your ecosystem is looking like, what are the different threats and pressures that are facing it, and what are some of the intervention points for responding to those threats or pressures. So a highly structured process. It requires having facilitators who are trained in this process and know how to lead a group through it. And it involves a significant amount of work before ever meeting, a lot of preparation on the part of the planners to sort of get the group ready to go through this process. What it results in is something that looks like this, which I don't expect anyone to be able to read, but it's this sort of very kind of multifaceted map of what the intertidal is and some of the threats facing it. And this is what the group built over the course of the first couple of meetings in the intertidal workshops. But what we see over time is there's a shift from that very structured process of building this conservation plan to field trips where the harvesters become the teachers, where they are, here we've got a worm harvester showing a participant how to put on their boots properly so that their boots don't fall off when they're walking through the mud. This is like a very different type of learning and a very different type of incorporating different types of knowledge from that kind of structured conference room, small group breakout kind of mental mapping process through to this more open format sort of learning together in the field. And that's a shift that we see regardless of if it's on a field trip or in a Zoom meeting, that over time these meetings kind of became less structured and less adherent to that conservation action planning tool and incorporated different types of knowledge along the way. But what does all of that lead to? The building relationships, the kind of framing to manage conflict, the incorporation of different types of knowledge. Like what are there like tangible outcomes that we can trace from that? I will say that is one of the more difficult things to really track down in this process. These are kind of fuzzy processes, you know, you're building relationships, you're talking, you're getting to know each other, and it's not always easy to draw a really bright and direct line from that to something like a research grant. But when I went through and talked to people and did sort of start to track these processes down, I was able to find some kind of more tangible things that you can look at as some of the more concrete outcomes of this process. One of those things is a documentation of gaps in knowledge. So for example, ice scour. There's concern in the harvester community around changing levels of ice in the intertidal as climate patterns change. That was something that was kind of interest to harvesters, but there wasn't really a connection to researchers. And over the course of these workshops, it sort of emerged as something that harvesters knew they were concerned about, something that researchers were then able to hear and realize we don't really have research on ice scour in the intertidal, and document that as kind of a gap in knowledge that's worthy of more attention. In addition to uncovering these gaps in knowledge, we find sort of a next obvious step from the research point of view, at least, is to apply for funding or receive funding to address some of these knowledge gaps. And that's something that we see in the course of these workshops. We see related to that the development of new research collaborations, whether it's working together on a grant application or finding a new field site. These are collaborations between researchers as well as across sort of agency researchers and industry members who started working together on kind of finding new field sites for sampling. And then throughout this all, we do see the continued support from other NPS offices. So there's kind of ongoing funding coming in or support coming in from the National Ocean and Coastal Program, as well as the Northeast region. And it continues to kind of be a priority in Acadia National Park, which is an outcome in and of itself. So some of the specific things to pull out of that include things like funding for a College of the Atlantic student to complete an ethnography of Acadia commercial worm harvesters. There was funding for University of Maine researchers, as well as a consultant to complete a report on what is healthy in the intertidal. Shifting some of the existing summer research programs to address some of these intertidal questions, like how are we seeing historical changes in mudflat biodiversity? There's the development of a partnership between the USGS and an oyster farm in town to find sites for water quality sampling. So there's kind of specific things that you can pull out of this broader process of building relationships, incorporating multiple types of knowledge and addressing a community conflict. With that said, there are also some missing pieces. So there are places for these workshops to grow and change. And I pulled out some of the quotes that really focus on something I heard multiple times over the course of this research about this sense of a lack of follow-up or more potential that was never fully realized. So just to give you kind of a glimpse of that, people said there was a lot of planning, there were a lot of ideas about what we were going to do, and then the follow through just didn't really happen. Someone else said it's sort of like we're building up, and we're just going to leave it alone. We've had our workshop, we're writing a summary, but there's no real follow through. And then from the planner point of view, from kind of within Acadia National Park, there's probably a ton more that we could do and should do. Unfortunately, we don't have the capacity, we don't have the funding, we don't have the mind bandwidth. The burning bridge has been doused, it's kind of charred, but it's still there. And now we move on to the next fire. So kind of keeping these ideas in mind of like the outcomes that were really positive, the relationships that were built, the things that we learned, as well as the sense of like, there's just not quite enough follow through. There's more potential that we didn't follow through on. And then there's really a capacity limitation to maybe follow through on that completely. How do we kind of take all of that and think about what the next steps for Acadia in this community engagement and intertidal management might be? And one of the questions that I heard throughout kind of thinking about, well, what are the next steps? What future would you like to see for Acadia? Is this question of what the national park's role in the intertidal is. And this is a multifaceted answer. I heard a lot of different comments about what the park could be doing or should be doing in the intertidal. And I think in many ways, the park is already hitting on a lot of these different roles. But of course, one of the first things you might think about is conducting science research for managing the intertidal within the park. And that's certainly something that the park does a lot of. There's a lot of research going on in the intertidal. But you can think as well about conducting all of that research to speak to management questions beyond Acadia National Park's slice of the intertidal as well. So how can the park sort of provide a role or a space for that research to happen too? There's of course a public education question. I mean, the park is a sort of an obvious conduit to a lot of visitors who come and have questions about the intertidal. Related to this as well, that's both with natural resources as well as cultural resources, the role of harvest, the role of different communities in this space. And in addition to directly serving as public educators in interpretation, there's a role for the park to be communicating more with these other tourism providers that also speak directly to tourists and really take on a lot of that like hunger for questions and knowledge and curiosity from folks who are engaging in the park, even outside of sort of speaking with park rangers or going to park events. There is a role to protect habitats in the face of climate change. People asked if the park could be more of a refuge or a protected area. Is there a space to kind of really think about how to manage in the face of environmental change in this small area that might have spillover effects that are positive for other areas? Is it enough for the park to provide convening space for these different people to come together, kind of the way it's been doing, and share ideas and build relationships? And then what can the park do in terms of finding funding sources for both park-specific projects as well as community projects, things that are happening sort of at the edge of or outside of the park, but that might really benefit from some of the resources here. And so I think all of these roles came up in part because they're things that the park has already dipped a toe in or is already very actively involved in. But I heard this question from planners and from participants about really thinking about what the park can do and provide in this space, and having that be a continual kind of conversation and a continual affirmation or reaffirmation of what the park is aiming to do. There are other kind of specific pieces of feedback that lend themselves to pretty specific responses as well. So, throughout I would hear, right, this question of follow-up, this question of what actually were the outcomes of these meetings. And so a pretty sort of straightforward response to that is to find a way to have more predictable communication from planners to participants. Maybe it's not super in-depth or super frequent, but that it happens predictably, and that people can go back and sort of find these records without having to do a lot of digging to kind of keep track of what's going on. I heard about long gaps between meetings leading to maybe some sort of lack of momentum. So there's a change to make in terms of having more frequent meetings. But that said, other people sort of mentioned that sometimes meetings felt redundant. It felt like they were meet and greets and go arounds and like we're covering the same ground and not really moving forward. So with more frequent meetings, you could also think about shifting the meeting model from this sort of open forum go round to having a more specific focus, maybe you're having a question to answer together. There were missing groups, important intertidal user groups that weren't represented or included in these meetings. So it seems like there's a role to be really thinking about creating spaces and processes that are relevant to the groups that are missing now. You know, maybe researchers are showing up like nobody's business to these meetings, and that's great. But maybe there's a way to think about how to shift the meetings so that they're relevant to other communities as well. And then related to missing groups are sort of different perspectives that are less present in these meetings already. You know, some participants and importantly, people who didn't participate talked about how they get a sense of these meetings being dominated by sort of a Western science worldview. So maybe there's room to expand the take on what we're thinking about science as to involve some more community-based or social science informed approaches. And I say continue to here because I think this is a change that you can already sort of trace in the trajectory of these meetings, where there's already a shift, like I said, to incorporate new types of knowledge or to think about interacting in different ways. And so moving even further with that and thinking about where that could go is kind of exciting. Of course, though, this is not sort of a resource unlimited area. So when it comes to implementing these changes, there are real constraints that the park is facing and that were, you know, made clear over the course of doing this research. Capacity is a real limitation on the part of the park. I think already park planners are going above and beyond and doing already more than you might think would even be possible. And it's sort of planners reflected that it would be difficult to increase the amount of time that they're spending on this already, given everything going on. So given that, how could we think about responding to a situation where there is a limitation in park capacity? Could there be future hires in Acadia National Park, maybe not creating new positions, as I gather that can be quite a task, but thinking about shifting expertise to specifically project management. So folks that can really have the skills to kind of keep these different projects going, which is certainly a task. If not future hires, maybe there's a possibility for really developing partnerships with existing partners that kind of clarify what different partners' roles in intertidal meetings might be and sort of how to keep this project going through drawing on the partnerships that already exist. And then maybe there's a way to continue this work that started where Acadia is kind of linking the work that it's doing with existing community priorities. I mean, we see that in the Thriving Earth Exchange. And so maybe there's a way to sort of, lean on that sort of collaboration to help address some of the capacity issues that are limiting how much time or effort the park can put into this. I also just want to say that after the most recent meeting in March, the planners of the meeting communicated out to participants and listed 7 projects they're committed to pursuing, with kind of clear commitments and clear next steps in a way that helps sort of clarify what the park can do and what partners can do as this work continues. So I'm kind of excited about that. I think it's a really makes sense as a response to some of the things I was hearing in interviews. And then I'll just close out with this idea about transformation. This is not like the by the book normal way for national parks to be engaging with communities. And it certainly, it offers a different path forward than some of maybe the historical roots of the national park system in a way that I think is really exciting. And I heard that too in my interviews as well. So I wanted to close out with a couple of quotes from people who see this as a transformative process in a way that kind of gives me a lot of hope. So one planner said, that's been the most transformative thing to me, the value of listening. That can be really powerful. It wasn't until I got here and got to these workshops that I really realized that dialogue can be so fruitful on lots of levels, on science levels, on management levels, on trust levels, and personal fulfillment levels. So there's real value, sort of other outcomes aside, of being in a room together and listening. And as a participant said, we're working towards something that's really going to be revolutionary as far as the National Park Service is concerned. And it was revolutionary, really. They never, ever worked with harvesters, and they never worked with communities. And I never got that, because everybody that paid taxes in those communities paid their salaries, a good portion of them. To me, that would have been paramount, to be liked in communities instead of being not really liked. And so this model of kind of bringing people together represents a real shift in some of these relationships, and that's pretty exciting. There's a lot I could say about these workshops. Clearly, I'm pretty fascinated by them, and I'm so grateful to have the chance to sort of join you all and join this community for the 3 months this winter, and to continue to be part of it. I want to really thank Abe, Hannah, and Rebecca for being so open with their time and their honesty with me, and as well for every interviewee that I spoke with. I learned a lot about what being part of these workshops was and what it could be in the future. I would love to stay in touch on this project, so if you have any thoughts, please feel free to reach out to me. And I think we also have some time now for questions, answers, discussion. So I will stop sharing my screen and hand it over to Abe, if I can. Hang on. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Ellie. That was great. Thank you very much. Round of applause. Thank you. So yes, so right now we have time for questions. You can put them in the chat, but we're a small enough group that I think you can also just go ahead and unmute yourself, turn on your camera, and ask away. I'll ask a first one. Sure. To get everybody going. So what was something that particularly surprised you kind of about the work kind of through the interviews? Because you did a fair amount of background work ahead of time. Was there something that caught you, that surprised you as you started doing the interviews?
Wow, that's a great question. Yeah, I think I was a little bit surprised, and maybe I spend too much time around critical theorists who end up being critical of most things, as sort of the spillover effect of maybe being in grad school sometimes. But I was really surprised by how sincerely people were appreciating efforts on the part of the park. Overwhelmingly, the take on the workshops was very positive. And it was very cool to me to see that people, they would talk about the early workshops that involved this conservation planning process. And what I didn't mention in my presentation is that this is a structured process. It takes a lot of preparation time. It also is exhausting by literally all accounts. Everyone I spoke to was like, wow, yeah, my brain was fried at the end of that. But still, there was such a positive response to coming together to work on this weird conservation planning tool that kind of turned your brain in knots and left you pretty drained at the end of the day. Something that on its surface doesn't sound that fun, really. But nonetheless, people were really there for it, very positive about taking part in it, interested in learning how this way of thinking and of seeing in the world, and kind of proud in the end, or impressed with this really spaghetti diagram. And I think throughout that, yeah, there were things that were strange or difficult, or places for the workshops to change, but nonetheless, people were really overwhelmingly positive about it. And I think, I was really pleasantly surprised to hear that, because I think it means there's a lot of potential for future like momentum on this work when people leave feeling good about the process.
Yeah, that's awesome. Chris, you want to go next?
Sure, I was just putting my face out there because I thought we could all just kind of put our faces out there too. But since you asked, hi Ellie. So one of the interesting things you mentioned was that after the last session, there a thing went out with a specific kind of like follow-up tasks.
Mm-hmm.
And this happened while you were like towards the end of your time, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so what I want to know is, did your research inform that decision to do that, right? Because one of your questions is like, you guys aren't following up enough. So I'm actually asking you behind the scenes, did you tell them, hey, you're not following up enough, you need to follow up, and then they followed up? So that's my question.
So behind the scenes, kind of,
or out in front, however you want.
Out in front. Yeah, well, I think that it's a really good question, Chris. What I like about it is that I think like the usual model of research is this idea that like you can do research on a thing, you can observe the thing and not influence it, right? This like the classic positivist approach to what science is, like observe the thing without changing it. And what's so cool, I think, about social science research, depending on how you do it, or community responsive research, which this maybe falls somewhere on that spectrum, is that there is kind of feedback and influence, and they're not kind of divorced processes of observation and like the thing itself. So I think it's a question for Abe and Rebecca and Hannah, kind of, really took the steps to pull together what those next steps look like. But I think there was kind of recognition throughout of what some of the places to really kind of change going forward could be.
So before Abe talks, I'll just say, I just heard a very roundabout yes.
I would say, I would say a good question for what's going on in the minds of Abe, Rebecca, and Hannah. But yeah, there was a lot of communication and dialogue across us as we were working together on this research project. I would imagine it influenced. So I guess I would say a roundabout yes. And that,
yeah, I can give a more direct yes. Yeah, I think while Ellie was here, and which is while we were doing this kind of most recent workshop, that we were very kind of introspective in terms of we had gone well and what we could improve on. I don't know if we made the decision about the email, the specifics of the email, before or after we heard from Ellie about the results of the interviews, but certainly it was, we were aware of kind of follow-up issues as well, and so just talking as a kind of a group, we were aware of that among other shortcomings of this work. So, but yeah, it definitely, hopefully these kind of best practices will stick with us, and as we go forward, without Ellie being here to constantly remind us about them going forward. But yeah, Charlie, you have a question. You have a question for Becky, but she had to drop off because she is actually giving her own talk right now, kind of a national talk on I think working with Indigenous partners for agencies, but or working with.
She must have known it was coming, Abe.
That's right. You're asking who's. Well, do you want to put a voice to your question? Do you want to go?
Yeah, I'll just say. So what's okay after all these years of meetings and stuff? Is there going to be any role for the park in the management of worming and harvesting? Who's going to be counting the worms, if anybody? And maybe it's too early for that. And maybe that's kind of a question that the park's not ready to address, but I'm just curious about it.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a good question. So right now, so we're working with Heidi Layton, who's the regional biologist for the Department of Marine Resources in the region, to talk about how we monitor the mudflats, and we actually have some research going on, and for last summer and then again this summer, that Anna, if she's available, might be able to talk about too, but revisiting some past monitoring work. There was monitoring work done in the 1990s looking at biodiversity in our mudflats, but we really hadn't revisited it since then. And so now revisiting it and to get an idea of how general biodiversity is related to particularly clam population abundance, but potentially worm abundance as well. Yeah.
And
Anna, did you want to add anything to that?
Charlie, I'm not really sure whether your question was like, I'm reading it. What will the park role be in any of the management of commercial worming? So, and I don't, obviously I work for Scudic Institute, I don't work for the park, but like what we can do is understand things like biodiversity in the mudflats, but in terms of management, like who's counting the worms as the wormers are bringing them out? Was that really kind of like more what your question was? Or is it like who's counting worms in mudflats? Because Scudic Institute in partnership with the park is counting worms in mudflats of all different ilk, not just the harvestable or commercial type, but I'm not really sure if that's really what your question was.
Well, I think that it was more directed at the commercial harvesting part of it. I mean, the monitoring of worms and clams and everything else in the mud flats, that's all great and important to try to do. But when it comes to commercial harvesting, which, generally speaking is not allowed in parks, and which certainly Acadia's never done. I don't know, maybe someplace like Glacier Bay does monitoring of fisheries. I don't even know that, but the park and other state agencies, in particular IF&W, have not always had a great relationship, and monitoring of fishery takes, even fishing activity, all done by IF&W, if at all, within the park boundaries. What's the deal with worms and clams within the park boundary?
I can speak to that, Charlie, based on the interview. I interviewed law enforcement folks at ANP, and then and then municipal shellfish harvesters, and I spoke to folks at the state as well. And so the change with the Dingle Act being passed, it formalizes this is it concurrent jurisdiction? But anyways, where the state has authority for any commercial harvest that happens in Acadia's intertidal. And it seems to be a really positive working relationship between Acadia law enforcement rangers and the state.
And then what you're saying is Acadia has none.
I think Acadia has management in the area, but in terms of specifically permits or
right,
like Acadia law enforcement rangers can check permits and can make sure that harvesting that's happening out there is permitted, but the permitting happens in the state level. It's through the state process.
Other questions? We have time for maybe one more. Jamie?
Yeah, I had a question that was just a follow-up to Charlie's question, or Chris's question, I'm sorry, which was, did you get a sense of how participants would like to receive communications and follow-up, and just like, I would love a little bit more detail on like, how frequently meetings like this? That's some really interesting feedback to get, I think.
Yeah, that's a great, I would say it varied, and sometimes it wasn't anything specific. It was just like, man, I'm kind of losing the thread on this and I would like to not lose the thread. So back in the day in 2016, there was actually briefly a website that consolidated a lot of these resources. along with this most recent meeting, there was a OneDrive that consolidated a lot of resources and sort of provided a place where people could go back and get them. And I think I heard a couple of times like, oh yeah, I kind of had to search through my email inbox to find these things. So I think people were interested in just like kind of a more collected place to go back to and use as a resource. On the planner side, there's conversation about some of the things that could be really positive. So Emma and Abe this year put together a kind of science year, well, for 2021, year of science in review. And it's like a web page, a blog post that kind of lists all of the different research projects that were going on in Acadia this in 2021. And so something like that is a really kind of a way to provide sort of that go-to spot for understanding what all is happening out here. So yeah, so I think there's a spectrum kind of different things you could think about from, yeah, just making sure there's kind of that people know the place to go to for holding these resources or for going back to as a reference. In terms of meeting frequency and like that level of commitment, I think, yeah, I think that varies more on an individual basis, sort of who has the time, who can call this part of their work, and also what are people's different levels of kind of wanting to spend their time at a meeting that's pretty focused on a specific target versus being quite happy to spend their time at a meeting that is about kind of just broadly hearing what's going on. So personally, I think if it were me, I'd kind of, and I had the capacity, I'd want to try out different approaches and kind of continue this experimental approach and see what was working for people. Of course, there are capacity limitations, but I think that would be an exciting route to go.
Great, thank you. Great presentation.
Thanks, Jamie.
Yeah, and I think with that, we'll let that be the last question, and we're just about at the top of the hour. So thank you again very much, Ellie. This was great work and really, I think adds a whole lot of value to the work we've done over the past several years, and then gives us something to work from to going forward. So really appreciate it. Thank you for the presentation. And for everybody here, we'll try to put this up if you want to on the Schoodic Institute's YouTube channel, if you want to let anybody that couldn't make it today, if they're interested in watching it in the future. So thanks a bunch, everybody, and really appreciate it. Have a very good afternoon.
Thanks you all. Thanks, Abe.
Thank you.